It's wonderful to be here. We love partnering with HCI, and we also love partnering with this team, Deloitte. Hopefully we have some new people in the audience today, but hopefully we have some people that have been here throughout the year, as this has been part of a series. We've been talking about the 2024 Human Capital Trends Report from Deloitte, and it's amazing to think we are here almost at the end of November, because I'm still referencing the 2023 report. I was just talking about it earlier this week. So what we wanted to do today was kind of have a lively discussion with these esteemed researchers and thought leaders around the discussions we've been having over the course of the year, with a line of sight to what's next for 2025. So what I wanted to do was introduce the panel and then get the conversation started. So without further ado, let's first introduce the panel. So first, I want to hand it over to Sue. Sue, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Thanks, Jason. It has been such a pleasure to be on so many of these with you this year and exploring our 2024 human capital trends. I lead what we call human capital eminence. It's really about thought leadership at Deloitte, and I have the pleasure and privilege to do original research, talk to clients around what are the challenges they're facing, what are the new trends that we're seeing, and really be able to produce things like the Human Capital Trends Report. One of my particular passions is pulling it through into tangible practices we can help companies with to advance the state of the field.
Wonderful. And next, I wanted to introduce Sana. Sana, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Jason. Wonderful to be back here with this team as we wrap up our season this year, if you will. And my role, I lead the Deloitte Alliance with Eightfold, and I work with organizations globally to help bring together strategy, experience, and process design informed by leading technology and the great AI capabilities of Talent Intelligence Platform. And when I met the Eightfold team back in 2019, I could see where this was headed and the synergies between the trends that we have here and how we might bring those to life for our customers. So here to help share some stories today of what we've seen in the field.
Next, David.
Great, thank you. So my name's David Mallon. I am a managing director in our human capital practice here in the US. I'm a human capital researcher by trade, and I lead a capability in our human capital practice, which we call research eminence and market activation. And it's about how we use research and sensing to help our practice make better decisions, to expand our footprint in market, and to ultimately make our solutions more evidence-based.
I love that. So with the 2024 Global Human Capital Trends Report, we've been talking about themes around human sustainability and rethinking productivity and workplace microcultures and creating digital playgrounds, these concepts of transparency, but also what it means to have a transparency paradox, the thought of an imagination deficit as we incorporate AI into our workplace, what this means for leading in new ways and thinking of leadership going into the future, and what's landing at the feet of HR in this concept of boundaryless HR. So to kind of summarize some of the conversations we've had over the course of the year, we looked at the series of conversations we've had and some of the questions that have come in and some of the polls that we had at previous sessions. And I kind of wanted to summarize some of those conversations and pose some questions to the panel. So for the folks that have been here, some of the folks that are new, this will be a nice summary or recap of those sessions. So I want to start with you, Sue. As boundaries dissolve from how we've organized work historically, we've talked a lot around the strategies we've used to organize work, but what strategies can organizations employ to reimagine work in new ways that are not only human-centric, but also adaptable to how work is changing so rapidly in real time?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I actually think you hit on a number of the strategies that we cover, but I think overarching, the idea is that when boundaries are dissolving, we need to stop using those old proxies that no longer fit a new world of work that we're all living in now. So, a couple of examples here. We think of workers as employees. That's kind of the old proxy to capture the singular notion of kind of full-time staff, but yet we're not really considering the full ecosystem of workers, all of the folks that create value for the organization. And that's a much more human perspective. And today with technology, we can find and manage a full ecosystem where workers, I'm talking about folks like gig workers, contract workers, workers in partners, partner organizations, and the like. Another thing we talk both in 2023 and 2024 about is this notion that this proxy of the job to describe work, right? It typically documents a set of repeatable functional tasks, but oftentimes it doesn't account for the dynamism of work today, where oftentimes work is performed outside of traditional job boundaries. And so this enables people to be seen more as whole humans when we think about them as collections of skills, as attributes, rather than just as job holders. And technologies like Eightfolds can help organizations better match workers to work, like projects and assignments, and let them be seen as full individuals. Another couple of strategies that we cover in our trends report is this notion of the proxy of culture, a monolithic one-size-fits-all culture of how organizations should operate. But in reality, what we found is that organizations are made up of an abundance of microcultures. They vary in the way they work and the norms and behaviors. And that's actually can be a good thing to elevate performance. And this enables culture to fit kind of local needs and be more human-centric around the human. And I'll just bring up one last one because there's a lot to unpack in that question. This notion of like the proxies of what we call employee engagement, which has been around for so long to evaluate the relationship between organizations and workers. And we question maybe when we think about that relationship, perhaps we should be thinking about the measurement of trust or metrics that also benefit the worker, both the worker and the business perspective. Because when you think about engagement, it's really about measuring discretionary effort, how much of that workers are willing to expand for their organization's benefit that helps the company, right? And so you had mentioned, Jason, we introduced the concept of human sustainability, which is about organizations creating value for workers, helping them be more employable, for example, or with better well-being. And our research found that actually helps elevate business outcomes. So this notion that we might want to maybe not measure worker activity or productivity so much, but rather measure the human and business outcomes, and have technologies help us with that is an important strategy.
I love that. At Eightfold, we have a podcast and I'm one of the co-hosts, and we have a theme or a motto of how you need to think, manage, and measure differently going into the future. And, what gets measured gets done. And in many cases, the way we're going to operate, some of those traditional proxies are getting flipped upside down, right? So what success looks like could be very different. So depending on what you're actually trying to achieve, you need to think about, well, let's drive those behaviors with the right measurements. For example, we were just talking the other day around if you're trying to drive mobility in an organization, those are different measurements than attrition and retention. Right. Attrition and retention are did they leave or did they stay? That's not mobility. Mobility is movement. Cross-departmental, not did someone go or did they stay in place, right? So 100%. again, thinking of things differently for the behavior you're trying to drive. I love that. And I think that's a great transition to my next question, which I'm going to aim at Sana. So Sana, you work directly with organizations putting this in place. What specific steps are you seeing HR teams take to try to integrate this more deeply with the business for strategic impact when they're trying to take some of these concepts and some of these kind of plans and bring them to the ground?
Yeah, Jason, I think what you were saying about we need to think, manage, and measure differently with the view of, the end in mind, what is success going to look like? So it's really critical for organizations to be thinking about stakeholder readiness and alignment at the front end of the process. Sometimes we'll go in and organizations will say, we've been working on our vision, we're all aligned, everyone is ready to go, let's jump in, let's accelerate. And what we find is that often just making sure that we are level setting and getting a little bit more time to engage with the stakeholders to get everyone's thinking aligned, and then use that to start thinking about change readiness for the broader organization is really helpful. Again, thinking about it with, I would say, a user experience mindset. So who are the personas, not only just the stakeholders, but who are the personas across the organization? That also requires us to start thinking about this concept of the microcultures that we've been describing, right? So kind of gone are the days where we've had traditional monolithic view of culture. So when we're going through this experience design piece, we want to be thoughtful about who are those individuals we need to engage? What are the microcultures that we need to enable? And make sure that we're thinking about that from a design perspective, an enablement perspective, and a change perspective. And then I would say, again, kind of breaking out of some of the traditional silos, we found organizations getting great value instead of just thinking about something narrow like candidate relationship management or talent acquisition, thinking more broadly about talent intelligence and where does that help us go as an organization, particularly as we look to achieving skills-based organization strategies and impact. So that thoughtful process, often we find we're able to actually accelerate some of those journeys of acquisition and mobility and even maybe resource management and workforce management. How do we think about that and align it with the business imperatives of that organization? Again, adding value as quickly as possible along that journey.
I love that. This kind of concept of talent-centered design, designing for the user, understanding the personas, right? Driving outcomes that deliver value to the business. And you're seeing it every day. By process of elimination, David, I'm coming to you. One of the topics that we summarized our series with was we focus a lot on technology and on automation and on AI and what that means to the work that people are doing. But for all of the things that it takes off of the plate, it also emphasizes the role of the human in the work that's left and the work that's remaining, right? So we've talked about that over the course of this series. How can organizations cultivate creativity and curiosity and empathy and all of the power skills across leadership and their teams for really amplifying the human in the leadership that's required going forward?
Yeah, so it's about my favorite thing. I'm glad you asked me this question. You called them power skills. Different groups call them different things. Soft skills, power skills, what have you. The term that we've used historically at Deloitte is enduring human capabilities, and we use that name intentionally because what you're describing are actually personality traits. They're things that are inherent to all of us as human beings. They're essentially this sort of they're like a bicep, right? We all have a bicep, but some people's are just in some folks it's big and bulky and well developed, and some it's not, right? They're all there. And so when we talk about cultivating those enduring human capabilities, they are part of what defines us as human, and we're not training them. We are trying to find gymnasiums. We're trying to find places to go practice and hone them, right? There's lots of great examples, for example, with empathy, particularly in like customer service contexts, where you put people into situations where they're sort of forced to see the perspective of the other person. And by doing that enough times, it's getting on a bike and actually practicing empathy. My favorite is curiosity. There was some great neuroscience research done recently that took pictures of people's brains and found that your brain when you're feeling curious looks exactly like your brain when you're feeling uncertain. So actually, it makes some sense. A lot of the work that's been done about how we develop that curiosity muscle is how do we intentionally put people into uncertain moments, sort of get them to think about things, to maybe go out and explore the world, look for signals, but on questions that are not easy to answer, questions that are actually thorny and somewhat unfamiliar. And so by doing that and by doing it in regular ways, just like just like going to the gym every day, by finding ways to sort of get on the bike every day and practice, that is how you would effectively cultivate someone's curiosity.
I love it. But also that leads to a conversation around building environments with psychological safety and learning laboratories where you build environments for um, strategic failure and the ability to learn quickly and fail fast. So I think that's a big part of how the world of work is going to change going forward, right? Maybe in the world that we came from, we operated very different from the fast iterations of how the world of work is going to be done going forward.
Absolutely.
So David, I'm going to stay with you for the next question, and this is about kind of the trends as they've evolved through the years. And I referenced how I'm still stuck on last year's report, and the world is moving too fast for me. The thing that I keep sticking on from last year's report is how last year's report talked about kind of the proliferation of skills-based strategies and how organizations were experimenting with skills-based strategies. And if you start to experiment in one area, it doesn't stay in one area. It kind of proliferates across the talent cycle. But then also how these things become dynamic and continuous, that we're breaking away from the traditional annual calendar or cyclical HR process to become increasingly dynamic and continuous as an HR function and as a talent practice. And that was a theme that kind of jumped out at me and has stuck with me and continues to be at the tip of my tongue as I'm in conversations. But as you've been at this for quite some time, how have the trends changed over the years if you've worked on this research?
Sure. Well, so we've been doing this since 2011. Now, if you went back and you looked at the reports in that kind of first 2 or 3 years, they're not going to look like they are today. They've evolved over time, not just in the kinds of things we uncover, but in just the research, the sort of structures and so forth. But we do think it is the longest and largest longitudinal look at what I've always liked to describe them as currents. It'd be very easy to think we do this annually. They're trends, that they're predictions. So actually not predictions. We're not telling the future intentionally. We've all had a chance to stand in the ocean or stand in a river and you feel that pressure. It's pushing you someplace. That's now. That's not in the future. And that's what we're trying to do every year, is to go out into the world and say, when it comes to the people side of business, what are those pressures that are sort of pushing us into different places? And if we can give them names and we can tell stories about them, then it makes it easier for us to be intentional about how we react to them, to sort of thrive in those currents, right? It is global. It's been global since the beginning. It has always been a not necessarily focused on HR, although we can talk about that. This past year, we surveyed 14,000 people in 95 countries. The story has been similar year over year. We always hit a very large global sample, and the stories are remarkably similar, regardless of whether you're talking about where in the world or industry or sector or what have you. Very similar issues, just the kind of conditions on the ground or degrees of difficulty might be different. And so that's very much true today as it was in 2011. I personally have been involved in space since 2014, and have been an author and a researcher supporting the project, and it is one of the greatest hats I get to wear in my role. So maybe I'll let you jump in terms of sort of talking about maybe the shifts in the trends.
Yeah, sure. The human capital trends was one of the reasons why I joined Deloitte, and I feel very privileged to now be part of this team. And I actually I've been an avid reader even for years, since the beginning, even before I joined. And I see 3 major shifts, I think, over the years. I think the first, and perhaps the most important, is this idea that we're really moving away from thinking that these trends are HR issues. They are really about people issues, and people issues are now at the heart of business and C-suite issues. So let me give you a little example and perspective on this. So in the beginning, towards the beginning of the trends, the report oftentimes focused on new trends in workforce practices, like new trends in rewards, new trends in performance management, new trends in talent acquisition. But in recent years, boundaries are coming down between those kind of HR areas and even between the HR function and the rest of the business. We wrote about boundaryless HR last year. And tech trends and business trends are converging with workforce trends. So today, you look at some of the topics we cover: trust, human sustainability, how advances in tech like Gen AI can impact the work in the workforce. And these are types of conversations we're having with our C-suite clients. So the second shift, I think, is that the kind of the rise of the voice of the worker and how important worker agency is. And this year in particular, we did a separate worker and executive survey to understand each of their perceptions and how they varied. And we've really kind of delved more into that voice of the worker over time. And third, if you look at our trends over time, you see a big shift almost from an organization-centric view to increasingly, you could call it different words, but maybe an ecosystem-centric view, or from an inside-out to an outside-in view. Boundaryless might be another term. So as an example, we wrote a long time ago about the overwhelmed employee. And just last year, we expanded on this notion about it being about kind of workforce ecosystems and not just employees. And it's about all workers, like contractors and gig workers and more, who contribute value to the organization. So you can kind of continue to see this like ecosystem view over time.
Yeah, I'll just round off to say, over the years, as Sue's describing, we've kind of moved from looking at issues in the people side of business, whether you give them, call them HR issues or what have you, to sort of more of a broader systems view of just fundamentally the relationship between workers and organizations and what they both care about, and kind of the backs and forths, the tugs and the pulls, the decisions that they collectively make and then individually make in the context of how we all work together.
So what we wanted to do was take a moment and hear from the audience. So if the HCI team can help us, we wanted to engage one of the polls. And we wanted to ask, what is your biggest priority as an HR leader in shaping the future of work over the next year? And you have a couple choices there. And we'll give you a couple moments if you can reach back for your mouse and pick an option, and we'll take a few moments to see the tabulation of the results. I always love watching the results come in.
Do you think people who are answering the survey later are influenced by?
That's
Yeah,
your
it always reminds me of a horse race. It always reminds me of a horse race.
Well, clearly the leadership has held at number one from the very beginning.
As Sue said, we're currently working on next year's trends, and we actually just recently came out of a fairly lively conversation about leadership.
Yeah.
And what we're going to talk about next year.
Yeah, it's a perennial, and it's so important because they really set the tone from the top.
Well, the next kind of session or the segment of time for our hour today is going to talk about the future of work. And I'm a little curious because redefining productivity is currently in last, but I've been having a lot of discussions around what does it mean to use generative AI?
Yeah.
And is it okay? And how do you give credit for it? And does that mean that that person knows what they're doing, and do we define that as value? And how do
Yes.
you account for productivity on the team? And if people are
Yes.
reading the co-intelligence book by Ethan Malik, he talks about how do you account for AI as a teammate when you're
Yes.
planning for productivity. So I think redefining productivity is going to be a hot topic going forward. It may not be at this moment in time, but I also think it's going to be a demand on leadership too. But
Yeah.
interesting results here. But I think it's a nice segue into thinking about concepts for the future of work. So, Sue, as you think about trends that you're thinking of the workforce and the workplace and the future of work, with an eye towards 2025, what's top of mind for you as you're preparing some of the research going forward?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on what you were talking about Gen AI. That is actually one of the things that we are researching and writing about, and I'm having a number of conversations about that around, how do we evaluate performance, and what metrics do we use when really work is co-created with AI and humans, and the boundary is starting to blur between the work that humans do and that AI does, as it becomes almost more than a teammate. It becomes an iterative part of what we do. Some people have called it centaurs versus cyborgs, right? So the cyborg is that kind of fusion of continually iterating, for example, with Gen AI, and the centaur is half horse and half human, where it's like separated, and you can kind of hand off the work to AI. So we are exploring that. A little sneak into next year's trends. And I might give a little historical perspective on future of work. Because I think it helps us, if when we look back, it helps us see where we're going forward. At Deloitte, we've oftentimes thought of it as, what's happening in workforce, what's happening in workplace, and what's happening in work. But in some ways, I think the boundaries between those three are becoming less clear. It points back to the boundaryless conversation we were talking about. And in fact, that word boundaryless was a key part, actually part of the title of 2023 and 2024 reports. And if we start by looking at kind of the workforce way back in 2011, in the beginning, we addressed the rise of contingent workers, right? And then we got even broader. And over the years, we talked about the open talent economy, and then the gig economy, and then even broader in workforce ecosystems, right? That could include workers as digital talent. In 2015, I think we wrote machines as talent. But in some ways, I think that distinction is becoming as we work more closely with AI than ever before, I think that distinction of machines as separate from us is starting to fall away, and we need to think about machines as just part of the work that we do, right? And embedded into work itself.
Yeah, I think also it's interesting in that or middle of the decade of the teens, when we were first getting started with these reports, we had started to use this word future of work, to focus on this trio that is work and workforce and workplace. We were already talking about, as Sue's pointing at, that inserting technologies, dropping them into the organization and just sort of expecting them to be adopted, that was not going to result in sort of optimized value. So we were already writing about how to take full advantage the future of work. It's not incrementally make work better. It's the future of work. So that's about changing the work. That's about redesigning jobs, redesigning the relationship that the workforce and the work has to each other, where it happens in the workplace, right? It's about redesigning these things in ways that is not about, it's kind of cliche, but it's true, not about doing old things in new ways, but about doing new things.
Yeah.
And finding that trade-off between humans and technology. So go ahead, Sana.
Yeah, I was going to comment, that I think, when we think about reimagining the work too, it's particularly interesting to watch what's been happening in the talent acquisition arena, right? Trying to get beyond the traditional mindset of we had sourcers who did certain work and they fed into, and the recruiters did certain work. And now with the ability to have the talent intelligence and the concept of talent rediscovery, never having to start from zero, right? This old concept, I have an opening, I'm going to post it, I'm going to talk to the hiring manager, I'm going to see who applies. there's so much now that, you know, the doors are just wide open in being able to access the talent information and talent communities that organizations have invested in over time, whether those be external talent pools or internal talent pools. So it's really a reimagining of, as you said, it's the future of the way we work, not just doing it better and faster.
Yeah, and I connecting what you just the example you're giving to Jason's question about, you know, the polls showing, you know, productivity perhaps being at the bottom of that list. We have this intelligence now. We have these tools. We are bringing these technologies into work, and they are allowing us to ask different questions in how work happens, and ultimately then to try to make, you know, better things happen. So something we've been talking about in the last couple of years is this notion of how do we unlock in through the work that we do every day? How do we unlock outcomes that are both human outcomes that are beneficial to the humans doing the work, and business outcomes, obviously, that are beneficial to the organizations? And those two things combined is something we call in this year's report human performance. And it is not either or, and it is not one, it's not trade-offs between one or the other. It's actually recognizing that they are together in concert. Yep. And to get the best out of one, you have to get the best out of the other.
Yeah, absolutely, David. I mean, I look back at kind of throughout the years, we've taken a human-centric approach to trends, and you'll see that in next year's trends as well. But that human-centric approach has really evolved over the years to focus more on those human outcomes and the multiplier effect of business outcomes. But when you look back over time, you know, we moved from like DEI in the pre-COVID years to well-being to last year. We really called human outcomes human sustainability is what we coined the term. And we really defined it as the ability to create value for all people an organization touches. And that could be greater health and well-being, stronger skills and employability, good jobs, opportunities for advancement, progress toward equity, increased belonging, heightened connection to purpose. And it's that kind of human outcomes multiplied times the business outcomes. It's like a multiplier effect rather than an addition effect that we really felt like started to crack the nut on elevating performance for the good of everyone, for organizations and for people.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I was just going to say, going back to Sana real quick, Sana, some of the organizations that you're working with aren't just optimizing processes, they really are transforming. And to think about this concept of boundaryless, they're breaking down silos of teams, they're breaking down silos of processes, they're re-examining policies, they're reorging departments, they're thinking of processes in new ways. It really is transformation, right? They're looking at ways to do things going forward, and you know, policies that were created 10, 12 years ago are no longer valid, right?
Absolutely.
Everything is up for discussion, right? And it really is designing a new way of operating. So it's not taking something and making it faster. It's designing a new way of working. And then Sue, you know, you were saying this equation that was in the report, this human outcomes times business outcomes equals human performance. And I think that kind of transitions to the next section we wanted to talk about, which was kind of empowering your workforce, because we had a whole section during this series this year around, in the face of kind of uncertainty and dynamic changing times, how does an organization drive sustainability, right? And I know Sana has been working with a lot of organizations that are trying to understand how to empower their workforce and maximize the capability that's already on their team, right? Leveraging skills intelligence and understanding who's already within their walls, whether they be real or virtual.
Yeah.
So with that, we do have another poll question. So if the HCI team can help us, what do you believe is the most effective way to empower your workforce? So let's see if the audience can help us here with their answers. And I think this may help us get to the next section of our discussion here today. and the race is on.
And it's so hard to just select one. I think learning and growth is just so critical, and that's a perennial that I think is going to continue to grow more important over time. And harkens back to what David was
Yeah.
saying around human capabilities, and the ability to learn how to learn is kind of a meta capability that is going to become increasingly important. And when our work is so ever evolving and changing, to go back to what I was saying about human sustainability, we all need to have those skills to be continuously employable.
You
Yeah, and
know,
the
it's
learning.
really,
Go ahead, Simon.
yeah, I would say it's really interesting to see this. And, you know, thematically, the top two kind of come together when you think about some of the offerings that organizations are focusing on to give agency to their employees. And what I mean by that is, you know, that we've kind of moved from a mindset shift of so much focus on talent acquisition and bringing new talent into the organization, which was a big focus when we were seeing, you know, the evolution of the talent intelligence platform and the skills-based AI strategies. But over the last 18 months, we've seen a real shift in that, with a significant increase in the focus on what I would say kind of collectively the talent management capabilities, a real focus on opening up the learning and development aspects and giving the individual the ability to really understand where their skills fit, be able to express their preferences and where to go with that, in addition to then, you know, rethinking internal mobility in a way. And I really like, you know, some of the concepts that Salesforce has introduced. So at Dreamforce this year, they announced that they were rolling out their Career Connect. And the concept with this is really thinking about it as a career mosaic. So how might an individual understand how their skills can continue to be progressed within the organization, and what opportunities would that open up for them, you know, laterally and upwards, and opportunities to contribute to the organization. And so they've just launched for their over 70,000 employees to create career passports, which are basically a profile that has insights to skills that are curated for them. And then these personalized career mosaics, so jobs, career paths, courses, and the concept of a career navigator that they are having access to. And that will continue to grow in terms of capabilities, moving in things like mentorship and gigs in the future. But the early kind of results are from their pilot that they had incredibly strong engagement with the community that was in the pilot. And over 90% of the internal positions that were filled during that pilot timeframe for that cohort came through that mechanism, really high engagement and learning and repeat kind of navigation to this Career Connect piece. And with the global launch, I think it was just great to hear, you know, one of the comments was, it was such a fun and easy process. I loved the experience of seeing how my skills come together. This has been so helpful. I already have role suggestions and course suggestions day one out of the gate. This is really cool. So you can see how empowering this is, right? So gone are the days where it was so hard to get insight into what learning opportunities are meaningful for me and what opportunities for career growth are with this new construct.
What I like about this example is it's just the top two things on this list are just so ripe for disruption and reimagination. And that example is a good we've been on this progression. We've been talking about, you know, for across all the trends, the decade we've been doing them, moving from ladders to lattices to jungle gyms to, I love the mosaic concept. It really is about, as we've begun to think about our identities, and I think that's really an important word to use here. As we think about our identities as workers in work, it's getting past the notion that our identity is a job with a job title in an office, right? And it's more about, well, what can I do? What value can I bring? How can I expand what I do? How can I expand the value that I bring? And that isn't necessarily going to be about this notion of sort of forward progression, or it may not even be about that kind of movement. It may just be about I am just more impactful tomorrow than I am today.
Yeah, yeah. And what I love about
Well,
that, what it takes into account for is that empowerment and that individualization. Because to your point, David, not everybody wants to move vertically or in a particular way. And so it gives that empowerment and, just connecting this to some of our work and trends. We've written a lot about the skills-based organization. In 2023, we wrote about end of jobs and the whole idea that you can dynamically match skills to work, skills to learning, to create a more personalized experience, mobility rather than, traditional ladders. And then almost being able to, also, I think importantly is to look at adjacent or near skills, not just the actual skills you have, so that can open up areas for you to develop using that adjacent or near skills as a foundation. And then when it comes to talent acquisition, being able to use affirmative filters that screen in people based on skills, or adjacent skills to open those doors of opportunity and movement.
I was just going to say, to kind of reframe or rethink that concept of career ladders and promotability, there's a lot of organizations that are trying to remove bureaucracy and expedite decision making and become more horizontal or consolidate functions more operationally. And we were talking to an organization that's going from 14 job levels down to 4.
Yeah.
Right. And if you operate in a world that looks like that, it's not about promotability. It's about right, because there's not as many levels. Right now, it's about employability and what skills do I have where I can contribute to the team, and it's about moving horizontally, and adding value to the organization in a broad way. So it's thinking about your career differently, and the value you add to the team and kind of the network that you have. So the world of work is looking very differently. Um, David, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, so picking up on something I had said before, I do think we do, as individuals, I think we have a role to play here, not just organizations. So I'll go back to one of the things I liked about what Sana's example pointed to, is that as organizations, what we really owe the individual is to help them with real guidance about the choices in front of them and the implications of those choices. But ultimately, as individuals, we do have, as you said, we have empowerment here. We have the ability to exercise those choices. We have the ability to make not just choices about, this isn't just a traditional learning and development question. It's not just about, okay, well, do I go take a course or watch some video on YouTube, or do I, or what have you. It's not necessarily about how I do traditional education. It is as much about the choices I make in my day-to-day work, and how, where do I deliberately try to put myself into sort of a stretch situation, or where do I deliberately sign up for some sort of gig assignment in the organization, or where do I just aspire for more, right? And making those intentional decisions is actually, and then finding moments to reflect about how they go. That is always and will probably always be far more developmentally impactful for us than engaging in some sort of course or class. I guess that's my first reaction to your question.
So Sue, in the report this year, we've talked about this new equation, but earlier in this hour we talked about the poll, and the topic of productivity came up, and thinking about measuring it in new ways. In the research this year, we talked about this concept of human performance. So can we talk about kind of this thought around thinking of human performance in new ways?
Yeah, sure. So here's one interesting stat that we uncovered in our research this year. We asked people, how effective are you at evaluating the value created by workers and how to unleash that value? The answer was 17% said they're effective at it. So, it's tough, right? Do we equate value with productivity? And when we think about the word productivity, it's been around since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, right? And it's literally defined as output per hour or net output. So it's output oriented, it's input oriented, it's activity centric. Things like time on task or revenue per employee, inputs and outputs, rather than outcomes. So that focus on that human performance is focused on outcomes. So actually this year, a little sneak into what we're writing about, David and I just had a conversation about, you ask anybody how their day is going at work, and inevitably they'll say busy, right? We equate busyness with performance, and I think we need to decouple that. Is busyness performance? Not necessarily. So we need to focus on outcomes. So that new math is really, we really think that we need to have not just business outcomes, but the human outcomes, what we call human sustainability, that they're mutually reinforcing. And part of the trick here is that, we touched on this before, is that one of the reasons why we haven't gotten there is because it's so much easier to measure busyness or activities. And we're just, I think, beginning to be at the cusp of an era where, now that nearly everything is digitized and we have so much data, we have unstructured data, the ability to collect real-time data. Can we actually start to make a dent in measuring more effectively the value that workers create through measuring human and business outcomes together?
David, your thoughts on that?
I mean, in some ways, this is, I think Sue even hinted this earlier. In some ways, this is all, it forces us on the ground, our clients ask us these questions. It forces us to think about traditional processes like performance management.
Right.
And so how we've looked at that, how that's worked over the years. And I don't think it's not going to come as any great surprise to anybody watching this that, organizations have been trying to break, disrupt, fix, reinvent performance management for as long as I've been in the world of HR and human capital. And I'm not sure anybody would say that they've entirely, cracked that particular nut yet. Because we are trying to do so many things at once, because we are trying to understand the value that individuals bring. We're trying to make decisions about our workforces, about the organization, about sort of who gets promoted, who gets rewarded. We're trying to grow as teams and as a company, right? So we're trying to do all these different things, and as Sue has just articulated, the vocabulary, the metrics, the information that we use is sort of a moving target, and in the past has been mostly focused on what was easy to measure, because that was easy to also trust. That's an important element. All this is trust.
Right.
And as we're realizing that just because it was easy to measure doesn't necessarily mean it actually points at the outcomes we all want to be true. It's forcing us to go, okay, what would we collect? What information, what intelligence would we collect that would tell us whether or not those outcomes are true? And do we trust that data? Do we trust how it's collected? Do we trust how it's going to be used? That hints back to a couple of previous chapters written the last couple of years around workers and worker data, and workers having some agency over what data is used. And last year and this year about transparency, and what information is shared to who for what reason and why, right? These are all important questions, and ultimately you have to resolve them if we're going to make this human performance equation a reality.
So I think that's a great segue into this last section of the time today. Is part of the benefit of the technology we have and shifting to more continuous processes that are dynamic is the immediacy of information that we have. And that's part of how I feel we can better prepare to operate in more uncertain times, because you just have more information at your fingertips to be able to react to things dynamically. Research has shown we're not very good at predicting things. We're actually better just reacting to them. So the best combination is to have a dynamic approach. But you mentioned this transparency paradox, right? And the trust element. So for this concept of kind of data and analytics and where things are going, what are you thinking about for kind of where we're headed in the future, and uh, especially with the world of AI and this kind of trust component? What's top of mind, or some of the things that are keeping you up at night?
Well, I'll start
Or
just to
maybe even,
say,
or maybe even spin it more positively, exciting you.
well, no, I mean, worry or excitement, I think the answer to the question would actually be the same. And it's not necessarily a new one. Even in 2018, we first had a chapter on what we now call people analytics. The core question we're asking was how far is too far when it comes to the data about our people in the workforce. On some level, there's reason to believe that this particular pick your cliche. This particular train is left the station. This horse left the barn. There's lots of data in the world, and there are lots of HR tools, AI tools that are being expanded upon and developed every day, and more uses for it. And so it's not a matter of if there'll be ever more uses of data and ever more questions asked of that data and ever more questions related to work and workforce and workplace, the things that we're talking about today. It's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of kind of what, when, and how far. And so ethics and anchoring back to today's conversation, human performance in trying to make things good for both humans and organizations at the same time, that has to be our anchor.
Yeah, I might just add on a couple things. I mean, Shoshana Zuboff wrote a book maybe 5 or 6 years ago about this age of kind of AI surveillance, or right, surveillance capitalism, I think was the name of the book. And that's the area that we don't want to necessarily go into, right? Which is why we wrote the transparency paradox last year, because sometimes transparency, meaning if you collect data about workers and make it transparent, sometimes it can really help workforce trust if it's done responsibly, some of what David's alluding to, but sometimes you just need to make it private. And then that's that how far is too far, right? To be able to elevate trust, because sometimes we oftentimes think in the back of our heads that the greater transparency, the greater trust. Well, that's not necessarily true in a world when we can collect data on workers as they work. So a couple principles of responsibility that has been really backed. We've done a great deal of research on this in the last couple of years. One is give to get. That's the heart of, I think, the 2023 trend on negotiating worker data, which is you need to get the data, you need to give benefits to the workers, right? You need to clearly tell them how their data is collected and used. You need to be able to obviously account for an ethical AI framework and monitor for bias and the like. I mean, Jason, you had asked where we think it's going, and a couple interesting questions we're pondering this year is, for example, if your data and expertise is baked into an algorithm or baked into an AI system, do you get rewarded for that over the long haul, right? Like, Gen AI sometimes is collecting qualitative data. It's collecting images, for example, on sites like Shutterstock. And, how do we reward workers when their data or their work is being used in Gen AI? And how do we give credit for them, right? So this topic continues to be a hot topic that evolves over time as technology evolves.
One of the things that I think is, when this give and get piece, and it kind of reflects back on some of the sentiment we're hearing as organizations deploy talent intelligence for their organizations, is the excitement that employees are sharing when it's explained properly, right? Like, here's what we're going to be providing to you, and here's how you'll be able to use it to navigate, to have more transparency, right? To build connections and to build your career. And some of those are just even just the straightforward ability to navigate connections and see people that have like interest or like skills, for example, provide great benefit in terms of kind of the sentiment of the the worker population in terms of what the value is for them of this data that's being utilized.
Well, this is why I've loved this series, and I've really truly enjoyed the conversations with the three of you, because it's not just the technology, it's the strategy, it's the culture, it's the leadership, it's the empathy, it's the management. And the conversations we've had have brought all of those things together. So I hope the audience has enjoyed the series. I've enjoyed the research, but I enjoyed how these conversations have brought the research to life. I've enjoyed Sana bringing some of the implementations and examples to the real world. And I'm looking forward to the report from 2025 so we can reconvene these conversations in the next year. But not too fast. Let's enjoy the holiday season. But thank you so much for the series, and appreciate the robust conversations and everyone's participation. But thank you so much, Sue, David, and Sana.
Thank you,
Thanks, you too.
Jason.
Thank you.
And back to you, Sarah. Thank you so much, HCI.
Well, thank you so much, very much, Jason. And just to reiterate, we're extremely grateful for this enlightening series of webcasts, the webcast today that you brought to our HCI audience throughout the year with your with Eightfold and the Deloitte consulting team. So again, thank you for all of this wonderful content that you brought to our audience. And also just a reminder to HCI members that today's webcast has been approved for HRCI and SHRM credit, as well as for HCI recertification. Your credits for attending this webcast will soon show up in your My HCI profile under the transcript tab. And while you're there, don't forget to check out hci.org for even more insights, as well as information on our certifications, live conferences, premium membership, and more. And just one more final thank you to our presenters today, to the good people at Eightfold and Deloitte Consulting, and also, of course, to you, our webcast viewer. Thanks for spending the hour with us, and we'll see you all next time, and looking forward to 2025 and hearing from you all again. Thank you.